guest, Dr. Rajan Kumar. Hello, sir. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Geetika. Good afternoon, friends. And today I thought, because the students are always asking that there should be some discussion on the basic concept of research method. Before we proceed to what actually research is and what are the methods of doing research, it's very important for the students to understand what are the basic concept that you need to understand to basically to get into the different methodologies that we'll talk in the series of lectures that we're planning to do it here. For the time being, let me tell you that what are the concepts that I'm going to discuss in a brief time today. We'll talk about very briefly. We'll talk about ontology, epistemology, and methodology. We'll also talk about constant and variable. I'll help you. I'll explain this with the help of some of the examples, and that will be very useful for you. Then I'll talk about hypothesis. What is hypothesis? How to formulate hypothesis, and some of the examples from social science. I'll also explain you what is theory, and with the help of again example. Then often there is some confusion about validity and reliability. Students always ask me these questions, that what is the difference between these two concepts. So I thought it's important to include these two concepts. And unit of analysis, when you choose a topic, this unit of analysis becomes very, very important. I'll define today in lecture. I'll also tell you this method of inference. The term often used in the literature is inferential method. So what are the method? What is inference, and what are the different types of inference that you need to make for conducting any research? Then I'll also talk about correlation and causation. Correlation, what is correlation and what is causation, and what are the differences between these two concepts. Then I'll come to necessary and sufficient condition. What are the differences between these two concepts? And finally, to minimize the biases, how to kind of eliminate biases in your research. We'll talk about, depending on the time today, we'll talk about selection bias, omitted variable bias, multicollinearity, which is used again for this quantitative method, ethnocentricity, and then the ideological issues, that how ideology can bias the research, and the problem of endogeneity. So these are the basic concept that I'm going to discuss today. And the first part in today's lecture, I start from ontology, epistemology, and methodology. If you in many of the lectures, or if you just read some literature, they're always talking about the ontological, which is part of broader philosophy of research. That how what is ontology, and how far a student doing the research should get into ontology, epistemology, etc. Although many of the researchers do not necessarily indulge into these philosophical underpinnings, but it's important to understand what actually is ontology and epistemology. Ontology is what constitutes reality, and how can we understand its existence. Because when we say that you devise any method for research basically to get to the reality. Now the point is what is reality? That's the philosophical question. That's the ontological question. So what is reality, and how do you get to the reality? So this philosophical question are very complex, and I'll briefly tell you what are the different debates on this issue of ontology. Epistemology, episteme is knowledge, and logy, as you know, the study of knowledge. So epistemology is basically study of knowledge. How do you get to knowledge? So we'll briefly talk about it. And the next slide is basically on ontology and epistemology. And finally, methodology, that what are the strategies and techniques that you need to get to the reality. So these three things I'm going to discuss today. Ontology, the are philosophers who are divided on this particular issue. What is ontology, and how do you get to the reality? So objectivists will argue that reality is out there. You just need to observe it through your sensory organs, or with the help of certain technological aids. And this is the positivist argument, that the positivist will argue that reality is out there, and you just need to observe it through your sensory organs, or with the help of technological aids, applying the scientific method, what they call it. On the other hand, you have subjectivists who will argue that there is no reality, and everything is interpretation. So the debate between facts and interpretation also, the debate comes in here. Subjectivists, they think what you consider reality is nothing but interpretation. So that's against the positivist argument. That's against the objectivist argument. And the third is critical realism, which argues that reality is there, but we need to understand only through interpretation, given the finite and limited human capability to know only the part of the entire picture. And this is the Kantian argument, critical realism. And personally, if you ask me, so I'll place myself somewhere here that reality is there, but our understanding is always limited. Our understanding is always partial, because there is no way to get to the complete reality. Even the reality is very complex, and the purpose of research is to make sense of the reality, not to exactly portray the picture of it. If you want to define any concept, for instance, even the innocuous concept like war, what is democracy, what is globalization, what is political system. So the reality is very complex. You can never give the complete picture of any reality. So what do? You through research or through your writings, you basically try to present a picture in a simplified format, so that it becomes comprehensible to you and also to the audience that you are targeting. So the purpose of research is to basically simplify the reality, to make it comprehensible to the people, or to the audience. So in terms of the application, what you need, that in case you have a concept, you need to define the concept, you need to conceptualize the theme, and you need to classify into certain categories. So these are the ways you can actually make reality comprehensible to yourself and also to the audience. And what are now epistemology, when you study knowledge? So what are the modes of getting at objective reality? One is intuitive. Intuitive is based on your experience, or some of the people say that they have the eureka moments. So intuition is very important aspect of getting at objective reality. The second, and which is very important for you and for any researcher, is authoritative knowledge. Where I'm talking about the professional knowledge. If you're working on democracy, if you're working on a political system in a country, or if you're working on ethnicity, nationalism, whatever the concept that you're talking about. So there are a number of people who have done research, and you need to engage with the researchers of the previous scholars to actually understand the professional knowledge that is there in the field. So that's the second way of understanding getting at the reality, that you read somebody's literature which has already been written by a lot of people. The third is analogy and or metaphor. That it basically refers to some kind of comparison, some kind of similarity, dissimilarity that you do, and you try to understand through that analogy with the real object that you want to study. Because if the objects are similar, so with certain kind of analogy you can understand the other object which you have not seen with the help of the object that you have seen. With the help of something that you know, you try to understand something that you have not known or you have not observed. So that's the analogy I'm talking about. Logical inference, again, there are two processes, and you know it very well. You have studied in your previous classes. This one is inductive, and the second one is deductive. In inductive, you go from particular to general, from sample to population, for instance, and in deductive you go from this general to particular. General to particular, which means basically, for instance, in social sciences, if I have to give you an example, if you start with the theory and then with that theory you try to explain a certain case, so that is an example of deductive method. Or on the basis of population, you are trying to say about a particular case, or you're trying to explain a certain case, so that again is a deductive method. Empirical part, you also you try to get to the reality through this observation, with the help of course, when you go to the field, you interact with the people, and through your this sensory organs, you try to understand the reality. So these are the methods of getting at objective reality. So the three things, ontology, epistemology, and methodology. So now I'll come to the third part, which is methodology. And methodology is a very vast subject. Is divided into qualitative and quantitative. In qualitative, there are different categories we have this historical method, we have case study method, we have discourse analysis, and in quantitative method also you have the statistical method. Then again you have this game theory approach, etc. So it's a very vast subject, and for your research, what you should do that you should have the basic understanding of the most of the methods. Actually, that's the best way to learn. That you try to understand what are the core elements, what are the core aspects, and what are the different approaches that various scholars employ to understand or to do the research. But what you should do that you should try to master one or two approaches. Even in qualitative, as I told you, that historical method, case study method, textual analysis, content analysis, and a lot of other things are used in the qualitative method. So if you're trying to apply qualitative method, you should try to master at least one approach. Nowadays people are employing not one, but sometimes they call it mixed method, where say for instance quantitative method would be combined with the case study method, or theoretical method would be combined with the case study method. So they use a combination of approaches to understand the reality. So it's completely your choice that what method you want to use for your research. But the important thing that you need to remember is that the method that would be useful for you will depend on the research question that you have in your mind, or research question that you have formulated for your research. If your research is philosophical in nature, so maybe the quantitative may not be very useful method. If your research is very normative in nature, then again the quantitative method may not be very useful. But if you are using, say if you have a lot of data available, or you're trying to collect the data through a structured questionnaire where you believe that you can actually collect the data in a quantitative manner, so in that case you can use quantitative method. So the best thing to remember is that there is no one approach which is suitable for all the researchers. What is important is that your approach should be decided by the research question that you have in mind, research subject that you have in mind. So that should determine whether you use what kind of approach you're planning to adopt, what is the research strategy that you're going to employ for your research. So I'm moving now from these two philosophical part. I'm coming to now a very important aspect where the students have a lot of confusion. For instance, all of us use the term theory. What is theory? How is it understood? Normally, if you see many of the scholars, the definition of theory is very cryptic and ambiguous, and it's not very, very clear. So what I've done it here, that I have given you the important features of any theory. The basic purpose, please remember, the basic purpose of any theory is to explain. If A is, for instance, if you have democracy, so the purpose, if you're trying to develop a theory on democracy, the basic purpose of that theory should be to explain. But please remember, because theory is based on best of the theories have universal implications. So when you're talking about the democracy, or you're trying to give the theory of democracy, you should not be confining yourself with any one particular country or one particular region, saying that my theory is applicable to just one particular case. The theories are universal in nature, and that's the reason theories are based on broader generalization, where you need to generalize based on all the cases that you have on that particular subject. For instance, when you talk of democracy, if you're trying to give a theory on democracy, so you have to study the features of democracy which are there in the world, basically all the cases in the world. Because even if you have one particular case, which one or a small number of cases which are refuting your theory, so then your theory will not stand the chance of validity. Your theory would be refuted, or your theory would be falsified, as Popper would tell you. So you have to have when you talk of theory, so broader generalization is very, very important. It should be applicable to all the cases in the world, all the units of democracy that we're talking about, or any theory. For instance, when Newton gave the theory or Einstein gave the theory, that theory had universal application, universal implication. So it actually included all the observable cases within that theory. It explained all the cases without any exception. And if you have one exception or if you have a number of exceptions, so either you reject the theory, or probably, in practical terms, most of the people actually try to modify the theory rather than completely reject the theory. Although Popper will tell you that, even if you have one exception, so you should reject the theory rather than keep the theory or modify the theory. But coming back to theory, the basic purpose of any theory is to explain the event, explain the phenomenon. So whenever you're trying to give a theory or you're trying to apply a certain theory, you should keep in mind that the purpose of the theory is to explain. So for instance, what are the causes of lung cancer? So then you try to come up with a theory that smoking causes lung cancer. So you're trying to give a theory, and then you're trying to test that theory on the basis of certain, you'll go and meet the people, you'll collect data that the people who have lung cancer and also the people who have been smoking. So you'll try to find a kind of correlation between these two, and then you try to explain with the help of theory how these two events or these two phenomena are correlated. So basic purpose of, as I told you, theory is to explain. Prediction is considered to be important aspect of important feature of any theory. The reason I'm saying that, if you have given a theory and you have tested the hypothesis where you found a correlation between this smoking and the cancer, lung cancer. So it has an element which is prescriptive. It has an element which is prediction, because you in future also you'll argue that that the person who smokes is likely to develop a lung cancer. So it has a prediction that in future also the people who smoke will it might lead to lung cancer in future. So every theory has some element of prescription or some element of prediction. For instance, when you give the theories that democracies do not fight, a famous theory of international politics, so basically you are trying to say that democracies in future will also not fight. So you can see that how theories have an element which is basically predictive. Universality, because as I told you that best of the theories have universal application. They're applicable throughout the world, throughout the universe. So you cannot say that my theory is limited to certain area. Although people have come up with certain theories which are limited in the scope. And Merton, a sociologist, he talks of theories which have limited application, but I'm not getting into that. Just I'm trying to clarify what is theory for the time being. Important criteria for any theory is falsifiability, and this is a very, very important contribution of Karl Popper when he argues that if a theory has to be falsifiable. If your theory is not falsifiable, basically it will not be categorized as a scientific theory. It will not be considered as a scientific theory. What I'm trying to tell you here is that falsifiability does not mean that your theory is false. What it means that it should have implication of being falsified, which means basically that your theory should be falsifiable with on the basis of observation that you made, on the basis of data that you collect. If you find a data which is contrary to your theory, which is contrary to your which refutes your theory, so then your theory stands basically rejected, or you should change the theory, refute, or come up with a new theory. So if you basically what it tells you that when you're trying to give a theory, don't give a theory which cannot be falsified. You have to give a theory which is falsifiable. And if I give you the example of Popper, when Popper tells you all the swans are white, if you're giving that kind of theory for example, then if you find one swan which is black, then your theory gets rejected, your theory gets falsified. So that's what I mean by this falsifiability. And falsifiability is very, very important aspect of any theory in the scientific discipline or in science, for this natural science or social science. And theory is also it's a non-factual statement, according to, if I use one theoretician, Kenneth Walsh from international politics. So it's basically abstraction. As you know that they are not just the factual statement; they are abstraction or reductionist approach to factual explanation. So it's basically abstraction from the observation that you have made. So it's a non-factual, abstract, reductive aspect, which is trying to tell you when I explain what the theory is, a non-factual statement. Now, given the limited time, I'm coming to hypothesis. What is hypothesis? Many times I've interacted with the students, and they come up with hypothesis is an assumption. Hypothesis is something which can be tested. Hypothesis is something which is a factual statement. So these are the kind of answers which I get from the students in the class and otherwise. But what you need to understand here, that hypothesis is basically a speculative, tentative statement about the possible relationship between the variables, and between the independent variable, between the dependent variable. So hypothesis is basically the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. But please remember that there can be three types of hypothesis. One is a very simple hypothesis which tells you about the relationship between two variables. Hypothesis can be causal in nature, where the independent variable tries to explain the dependent variable. And the second hypothesis can be this comparative in nature. If I say, for instance, that the GDP of China is growing faster than the GDP of India, so that is comparative in nature, and here the relationship is not necessarily causal, but it does explain that when you compare two economies, so it does explain one economy with the other with the help of comparison. So that's another method of another way of explaining any subject. The third can be a simple statement. If I say that just the country's GDP, India's GDP is growing by, say, in 2008 by 7.2%. So that is a testable assumption that can be tested. So please remember, hypothesis can be of three types. One is causal hypothesis, where you try to explain with the help of independent variable and the dependent variable. So what you do basically in that context, that you try to link up the independent variable with the dependent variable. Say, for instance, if the fertilizer increases, the productivity of wheat is also likely to increase. So that's a very simple causal hypothesis. If you have a vibrant civil society and media, so democracy is likely to be better in that country. So that again is a very simple hypothesis which is causal in nature. I gave you the example of this comparative hypothesis. Simply a simple testable statement can also be a hypothesis, and many times in economics people use that kind of hypothesis. For instance, the country's GDP is growing by this percent. So that is a testable statement, and that I've seen people using as a hypothesis. But that reminds me to explain you what is variable. Because it's very important to understand the variable and the constant. Because many times, when you try to explain something, when you try to explain, say, for instance, a certain event, that what are the causes of, say, for instance, cancer. So you say, it can be smoking, it can be drinking, it can be pollution, it can be the kind of life that you lead. It can be the absence of any exercise that you do. So what I'm trying to do here, as you can see that there is one dependent variable, which is cancer. Cancer is the dependent variable here, and there are a number of independent variables. For instance, smoking is the independent variable, pollution, your lifestyle is independent variable, then the pollution I already say. So these are broadly the independent variable that you can have to explain one particular dependent variable. Now, important thing to understand here is that many times we take constant as independent variable to explain something. Please remember that that doesn't help. If you're talking of a scientific explanation, and we're looking for factors or indicators or variables, variable means something the value of which changes. Variation. There should be some variation in the value of that particular concept. So it's very important to understand that when you're trying to explain, you always explain in terms of variable and not the constant. So here in this context, one beautiful example, I'll give you, that what is the difference between constant and variable, and why constant is not taken as a cause, and why variable is considered as a cause. Take for instance, you live on the second floor of the building, and somebody falls from that building. Say for instance, somebody falls from the second floor of the building. So what could be the possible causes of that person falling? Probably because he slipped off. That can be one of the causes. Somebody pushed him. That can be one of the causes. He wanted to commit suicide, so that can be one of the causes. Or simply that he was drunk and he fell down. He was unconscious. He fell down. So these are the possible causes of that particular event when you're trying to explain. But the fact that when I tell you the constant, the person, I'll ask you that that person fell down from the second floor of the building because of the gravity. The earth has gravity and you know it, but have you seen anybody saying or talking that gravity was the cause of that person falling from the second floor? No. But why do you not blame gravity? You know that that person fell from the second floor of the building and injured his leg because of the gravity, but excuse me. But you never blame gravity as the cause. You always blame the variables. That that person might be drunk, or he just slipped off, somebody pushed him from the second floor. So these are the causes. What I'm trying to tell you here, that you never try to explain in terms of constant, you always explain in terms of variables. Please remember that when you're trying to explain something, you always take variable into account. So now I believe that variables, the concept variable is very clear to you. So what are the different types of variable? One, independent, you already understood. The second is the dependent, you understood. Third is the intermediary. Intermediary variable is something which comes between comes between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So those are the intermediary variables. And when you do quantitative analysis, then ordinal, nominal, these are the variables that you'll probably use, and that when that will come later in this sometimes in the next lecture. A unit of analysis is very, very important. This unit of analysis, when you try to select a case or you try to study, the unit of analysis will depend on the kind of research question that you have framed, the kind of research you're planning to do. Unit of analysis means basically, for instance, I'm trying to explain, say, the behavior of the state, how Indian state behaves with other states in international conflict. So in that case, a state becomes the unit of analysis. In the Indian state becomes the unit of analysis. So I'll talk about the state policies. I'll talk about different units of which are there within the state. For instance, when you do a survey, you go to the field, you collect the data. So in that case, individual becomes your unit of analysis, because you are going to collect the data from that individual. If you are trying to study a caste system or a certain community, behavior of community, in that case, caste or the community becomes the unit of analysis. So this unit of analysis is very, very important when you actually do the research. Then two important thing that I would like to explain today. One is the correlation and causation, and the necessary and sufficient condition. So correlation, sometimes people confuse correlation with causation. Correlation basically is when the two events are correlated. Say for instance, A changing and B is changing, so that is correlation. But please remember that correlation is not causation. Say for instance, there is an area where the crime takes place and the police is there. But police is also increasing, the crime is already there. So can you say that police is the cause of the crime? No. What you need to explain, that you need to explain theoretically the relationship between the two variables, and that theory will help you to explain why there is a causation between the two events. So every correlation is not causation. Please remember, even if two events are correlated, it does not mean that one is causing the other. Causation is a theoretical concept, and here the different steps that you need to find out the causal mechanism to explain what is correlation and causation. Finally, this necessary and sufficient condition. So this, let me give you an example. When you do your research, when you explain something, you should always ask that what is the sufficient condition which will explain this particular event. For instance, if I want to become the President of India, I have to be of certain age, I have to be a citizen of India, I should not be bankrupt, I should not be prosecuted in a certain crime, and these are the necessary conditions. But if I fulfill that, and I actually fulfill that, so can I become the President of India? No. Because this I've given you the necessary condition, but this is not sufficient condition. Sufficient condition would mean that I should have the support of parliamentarians, I should have the support of the assembly people and the assembly in the states. So only then I can become the President of India. So you should try to understand the difference between necessary and sufficient condition when you come to to explain some event. So with this, I think I'll stop it here, and what are the things I left probably we'll discuss later. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session where we discussed on the basic concepts of research methods. Friends, we will be continuing further, and you're requested to be with us. We are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to the session. Dear friends, you know that today we are talking on research methods. In our previous session, we discussed the basic concepts, and now we are going to discuss steps for a research method. And for the discussion, we have with us in our studios Dr. Rajan Kumar. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Rajan Kumar, then do call us through a toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Rajan Kumar, once again, and would request him to continue further.
Thank you, Gitka. And in this part, I'll be talking about what are the major steps of scientific research. And please remember that today I'm talking about scientific research. So there are people who will argue that there are other methods of research which are not necessarily, which basically are critiques of scientific method. But today, if you're talking of scientific research, then there are four very, very important features that you have to keep in mind. I think the first and the foremost, the most important issue that you have to remember before you do research is frame a critical question. The question which the questions without questions probably you cannot proceed in the research, and this is the first step that you have to follow if you're planning to do any research. Second, if you get slightly more scholarly, if you want to get into the real research, you also try to understand what are the philosophical underpinnings, what are the philosophical assumptions behind the kind of questions that you have in mind. Although many times some of the researchers which actually will not delve into the philosophical aspect, and they'll just focus on the empirical aspect. But I think if you are into social science, some understanding of the broader philosophical roots are equally important. Third, estimate the data. Estimate the type of data that you need for the research. That what kind of data your research question, then you have to ask yourself that to answer that research question, what kind of data will I need? What kind of data will answer the research question? So the data becomes very, very important. For data, sometimes you also look into the literature, you do the review of literature, and then on the basis of the review of literature, you try to figure out how people have studied that subject, what are the kind of what are the kind of studies which have been conducted by the previous scholars, and whether your research question that you have formulated, whether your research question is similar or somewhat different, whether it can be answered by the data that is already available, or you need to collect a different kind of data for the research question that you have. So you have to keep in mind the research question number one, the data number two, and how do you analyze the data. So the three things, the moment you think of research, and the moment you think of designing your research, these three things are integral. So you cannot proceed in a research without research question, without data, and how you're going to analyze the data. How you're going to analyze the data forms the part of your this research methodology. That's what you learn in the research methods. So here, I come back to research question. It appears that we can easily frame the research question, but that the difficulty is that research question is it's not easy to frame, and you should always try to improve upon the research questions which are already there. King, Queen and Bhava, the book which came out in 1994, I've written KKV 1994. That's the book. The references are there towards the end, so you can check it from there. King, Queen and Bhava 1994. So these scholars, they tell you that these are the ways you can actually improve your research design. One is improve research question. Second is improve theory. Third is improve data quality, improving data quality in terms of validity of measurement and reliability. And that is applying the same procedure will produce the same outcome. So I'll come to that, validity and reliability, that what is the difference between these two, what are these two concepts. I'll come to that. And finally, improve the data use. All right. So these are the points that you need to remember if you are planning to do a really some kind of path-breaking research. If you're trying to do some original kind of research, so either you improve your research question, or improve your theory, or improve the data quality, or improve the method that you're going to use to analyze the data. So if you do all of them, then it's great. But even if you do at least improving the research question, so that means you are making a contribution to the literature, and it's very likely that your article would get published in reputed journals if you follow these approaches. So now the question is, how do you improve the research question, and what kind of question that you should ask? The first thing that you should remember that since all of us come from a discipline, all of us come from a certain broader either social science, natural sciences, or human sciences. So here you should ask a question which is socially relevant. I'm talking about the social science. So if the question is not socially relevant, then probably you'll not find many people working on that, and you'll find it difficult to engage in that kind of research question. So important thing that you should ask a question which is socially relevant to the world, to the humanity, to your society, or to the place that you come from. So and that's number one. Second, thing that you should keep in mind that when you're framing the research question, try to see that what are the questions which have been asked by the previous scholar, what are the established norms in the society or in the discipline. So once you identify those norms, once you identify some of the values which are established, then you can ask yourself that whether that value is actually established, or you need to ask a real question, or you need to reframe the question, or you need to challenge the norms which are already which appears to be established. In science, as you know, nothing is established. Science, as you know, science is all about change, and we encourage people to ask critical questions, and we encourage research method, scientific research method. We encourage scientific research method will encourage students to ask questions which are critical of the established norms. that's the second thing. First, ask a question which is socially relevant. The second, ask a question or frame a question which is critical to the established norm. So that would be a very, very important contribution to the literature if you do that. In third point that you can do that, there are areas or there are subject or concepts where a scholarship or the literature is divided, where so the people argue from certain perspectives, while the other people argue from different perspectives. Say, for instance, democracy, the concept of democracy. So here, the concept of democracy, the liberals will argue from the one perspective. The Marxists will try to explain democracy from the Marxist perspective. So there are certain divisions which are there in the literature. Even now, you can frame a question where which contributes to even one part of the debate. So that would be considered again an important. If you're contributing to the liberal paradigm of doing research on democracy, or if you're contributing to the Marxist paradigm of doing research on democracy, so that again would be considered important contribution to the literature. So adding more data to one side of the debate is considered important. So you can frame a question accordingly. So that's number 3. That how that will help you in framing a good research question. Now, frame questions, which basically, where you are, some of the times, not many researches have taken place, and there are very few researches. So you can have research questions which are very, very ingenuine, which are very innovative, which are also exploratory in nature. So not many people have worked on certain tribe, and you want to engage with the tribe. So you can have questions which are exploratory in nature, which have not been asked by the previous scholar. So that's another way of asking a critical research question. So these are the broader things that you should keep in mind when framing the research question. So now the second part is how do you improve the theory. Now there are certain suggestions that I'll give you briefly, and probably sometime later in the next lectures or something, if I get time. So I'll explain you what is theory and how to actually improve the theory. But for the time being, you should keep in mind that theory is based on, as I told you, broader generalization. Is based on falsifiability. Theory has to be a simple, concrete statement. So these things you should keep in mind when you're trying to either give a theory or you're trying to borrow a theory from some other area, some other person. So a theory, keep a theory which is, a theory which explains, and best of the theories are universal in nature, which means your theory should have as many observable implications as possible, which means your theory, if it should include all the possible cases within that domain. For instance, if you're giving a theory of democracy, so it should include all the democracies that you see in the world. You should not give a theory with a limited scope or a limited time space. Your theory should be broadly, the best of theories are universal in nature. So that you should keep in mind, that try to include within the theory, or try to explain as many observations as possible through that theory. So that's one of the things that you should keep in mind when trying to give a theory. Third thing, as I told you, that your theory has to be falsifiable. It has to be falsifiable, which means that if you're if you are giving a theory, then you should leave the space for falsification, which means that a theory can be falsified by the observations which are contrary in nature, or by the examples which basically become anomaly in the anomaly which cannot be explained by the theory. So if you have a number of anomalies which cannot be explained by the theory, so in that case you need to basically either modify or reject the theory. So the third criteria, as I told you, that you should try to give a theory which is falsifiable, and that's the contribution of Popper, as I mentioned earlier. Now some of the people argue that a theory should be parsimonious. it should be parsimonious. But most of the people actually they do not agree to this concept of parsimony. But only important thing to remember here is that you should try to give a theory which is concrete. You should try to give a theory which includes as many observable implications as possible. Third point, as I told you, that falsifiability is very, very important part of any theory. That theory has to be falsifiable. And finally, the data that you're using to support the theory. So the data recording process should be transparent and clear. So that your theory is properly explained with the data that you have. So the integration between the logic and the observation should be very clear in theory. So these are the broader things that you should keep in mind when giving the theory. So and in your practice that you do, you should, whenever you read a theory, try to check whether the aspects or the features that I told you are actually applicable to that theory or not. And you'll find that most of the theory actually they include, or the best of the theory they do include the features that I just referred to. Now improve data quality. Now how do you improve the data quality? So the data might already be available, or you may want to go and collect the data from the field, or you borrow the data from the data sets which are available with many organizations today, World Bank, United Nations, even the government data which are available with the census data, population data, family data, economic data, statistical data, etc. So you can take the data from one of these sources, or you can you can go to the field. Depending on the kind of research that you have, you can actually visit the field as anthropologists will do, because the data is actually collected by them from the field. But that may not be possible for some of the disciplines. For instance, like international politics. In international politics, say for instance, I'm dealing with the state, and there are more than nearly 200 states that I'm dealing with. When I'm trying to give a theory on democracy, or I'm trying to give a theory on war, or when I'm trying to give a theory on state policies or state or foreign policy. So in that case, it may not be really feasible for me to actually visit all the states. So. But if you're doing work on, say, a village or a certain community or a certain tribe, it becomes imperative to visit the field and collect the data from the field. So participant observation becomes very, very important for the case study and the anthropological study. In history, for instance, you cannot go back to the historical period unless until you're doing some the art and architecture kind of study or archaeological study. How do you go back to the history? That's the real question. That in history, if I'm trying to understand the Indus Valley civilization or Egyptian civilization, Babylonian culture of the ancient period, so I cannot go back to the history. I can only make some inferences on the basis of what is available, either in terms of literary sources or in terms of archaeological or art archaeological sources or existing architecture. So these are the so the data collection can be of different types depending on the subject, depending on the discipline, depending on the research question that you have. But important thing to remember is that the two concepts that you should understand is validity and reliability. That why your data should be valid in terms of measurement, and reliable in terms of its replicability. Validity, what it means is that that your data would be considered valid if the measurement that you applied is valid. For instance, this when you try to measure, say, water, you do not measure water in terms of meter. You always measure in terms of liter, right? So liquid is measured in terms of liter, not the meter. So, or if you want to measure the area of certain place, so you measure in terms of a square or a square kilometer, etc. So a square centimeter, a square feet, etc. So these are the measurement tools that you employ for measuring in sciences. So similarly, when you measure a certain concept, like you might be asked, you might be doing a research on ethnicity, you might be doing research on democracy. So if I have to measure the concept of democracy, so how do I measure the concept of a broader concept of democracy? So what you do is that you try to break the concept, you try to parse the concept into identifiable, measurable variables. For instance, what I'll do if I want to understand whether a country is democratic or not, so what I'll do is that I'll try to understand the variables, or try to find out the factors or the indicators which actually explains the democracy. For instance, I'll try to understand the civil society, I'll try to understand the role of media, I'll try to understand the competitive election, I'll try to understand the freedom of expression, I'll try to understand that how people respond to that concept of democracy. So these are the broader variables that I will identify to understand the concept of democracy in a certain country. So, and you cannot measure the country. For instance, if I do not follow these methods, so then measurement will be incorrect. If I try to measure democracy, say just by the amount of westernization that the country has had followed, so that will not be the accurate measure of democracy. If I try to measure the democracy just by the economic development of country, so that may not be the accurate measurement of democracy. So when you apply the measurement techniques of measuring certain concepts in social science, it's very difficult to measure the concept, and so it's not easy. So please remember that your measurement should be valid, and you have to ask as a researcher that whether the measurement tools that you're applying are valid or not. Your measurement, now coming to the concept of reliability, that reliability would mean that if A and B, these are the two variables, if A and B have led to say C, outcome C, in one place or in one particular time, so A and B should lead to C in the other A and B should lead to C in other places also, in other time period also. So that means your measurement is reliable. So applying the same procedure will produce the same outcome. So that's the definition of reliability. Say for instance, if H2O is leading to water in one particular context, the H2O will lead to water in other context also. If smoking led to, if researchers found that smoking led to cancer in one place, so the smoking will also lead to cancer in other places. So that means your research is valid. Your research is reliable. Your research is reliable because the outcomes that you have followed, or the procedure that you have followed that led to a certain outcome in one place or in one context, if you followed the same procedure in other place, other context, the outcome would be similar. So that's the reliability. So in terms of data, improving the data quality, you have to ask whether your data quality, your measurement is valid, and whether your outcomes are procedure that you followed are reliable or not. So these are the two concepts that you need to remember. Improve the data, improve data use. There you actually it would be explained if you basically understand what are the biases which come into a different kind of research. In quantitative research, is very well clarified that there are biases like selection bias, there are biases like multicollinearity, and there are biases like this problem of endogeneity. So these are the biases that which come up or which creep into your research if you're not careful about about the biases. But also remember that about the nature of biases, the scholars are methodologists are divided. Some of the problems which are clearly identified in quantitative research, those same problems are not considered biases in the qualitative research. So depending on the research method that you apply for your research, you should know what kind of biases you should be careful about. In quantitative method, for instance, selection bias, problem of endogeneity, multicollinearity, etc., are very clear. And in fact, some of the scholars argue, like King, Cohen, Bhabha, the book that I'll refer to towards the end. So they say very clearly that logic of inference is same in qualitative and quantitative. So even when people are doing qualitative study, they should be careful about the biases which are very clearly identified in the quantitative researches. But I've seen some of the people who are doing qualitative researches, they tell you that that may not be necessary. For instance, they say that qualitative people say that selection bias might be a problem in quantitative research, but selection bias is not a problem in qualitative research, according to some scholars. So I think I'll come to that probably sometime later, but not in today's. I'll confine myself to just make you aware that you should be careful about some of the problems like ethnocentricity. You should not be judging the people on the basis of your own value system, because the way you dress, the way you eat, the way you understand the world, so that might vary from one place to other. But if you're trying to be judgmental, that because the people in other places do not follow your culture, your ethnic group, your religion, or your value system, it does not mean those people are anyway inferior or you are better than other people. So when you employ that method, so that means when you're trying to judge other people on the basis of your own value system, so then you have the problem of ethnocentricity. So that is problematic, and you should be very, very careful about these problems. Then again, for some of the researchers are very ideological. So they follow certain ideological propaganda, and it becomes very, very difficult. And it's not very difficult to identify the ideological writings. All the researches are subjective. The researches cannot be without subjectivity, because as a researcher we have on our liking, we have our own value system, we have our own understanding of the world, but it cannot be completely free of the value system. Idea is not to completely eliminate the subjectivity. That's not practically possible. And scholars actually do agree now that subjectivity is an important aspect of of any research. But but what you should avoid is ideological biases. What you should avoid is ethnocentric biases, and what you should avoid is some other biases that I just mentioned in the lecture. Now here if you can see because we are talking about the steps of research. Then here, I'll tell you I'll give you two models, although there are other models as well. But I thought for your kind of research, this would be a very useful approach. So you start with the research question, then 4, 5, or the 6, 7, or whatever important research question that you have. Then you go to the review of literature. The review of literature would mean that basically all the important works which have been done on. You go to the library or you just Google it out and find out all the people who have worked on that area, and then you try to justify your research, that how your research is going to be different. So you basically give a rationale to your research. Then you go to theory. I've discussed about theory. Explain the theory. If you're giving a theory, then explain the theory. Or if you're borrowing certain theory or from your discipline or certain other discipline, just explain that theory, how that theory would be used in your particular case. And then hypothesis, I've explained what is hypothesis. So try to frame certain hypothesis. Then on the basis of research question hypothesis, you try to collect the data. So research question and hypothesis will guide you to the kind of data that you need to collect. Then hypothesis testing, how will you test the hypothesis? You will test the hypothesis on the basis of the data that you've collected. And once you've done that, then report the finding, come to the conclusion, and your research is complete. So that's one cycle. The second cycle I would like to show you here is you start with the research problem, the same research question. Most of the case study people are anthropologists. They follow these steps. So you start with the research problem, same as research question. Go to the review of literature, and then you select a case. If you're trying to do a case study, select a case. For instance, if you want to understand how Tata is doing well in country, or how tribal people in Jharkhand are behaving in a certain way. So you try to select a case on the basis of the research question that you have framed. Then go to the field, live with the people, try to understand the subjectivity and intersubjectivity of the people there. Collect the data, analyze the data, and then report the findings. So these are the two very popular approaches. I'm not saying they are the only ones, but these are the two very popular approaches that you can use for your research. Now finally, before I finish, I would like to show you the references here. So these are some of the references that you may consult, books that you may read.